Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Sharna, who I've come to appreciate as a force for change in regard to the support offered to women in dealing with their pregnancy loss, a passion we have in common. Talking about her miscarriage, Sharna shares.
Never experienced contractions before, so I didn't know that that's what I was experiencing until I got to the hospital, until they told me then what was going on. And they also told me that 1 in 4 pregnancies end in loss. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, then why do I feel like I'm the only one? Why is there not enough information? Why does no one talk about this? I felt like I was living under a rock. It's like, where have I been my whole life to not know about this?
About this week's guest. Sharna Southan is an ICF-certified coach, a mom to a rainbow baby, business owner and wife. She followed her heart and soul into business after her own pregnancy loss in 2017. Sharna firmly believes that our adversity gives us an opportunity to grow. She founded the Institute of Healing through pregnancy loss and supporting lost parents with her transformative pregnancy loss recovery method and teaching her signature pregnancy loss practitioner certification program. I am sure you will enjoy today's episode as much as I did my conversation with Sharna. So welcome, Sharna. It's so nice to have you on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm actually doing really well. A little bit exhausted from the day, but I'm okay.
So like I do with every one of my guests, why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your story of loss and trauma, about your life, and so that people can get to know you.
Yeah, so I guess my story begins when I was 19, and my dad passed away when I was 19. He was 49. It wasn't anything, that we ever anticipated to be on our path as children, to lose your father so young, and for him to be so young and for us to be so young as well. So that was like, I think, my first experience with really deep grief. And I didn't have any way of knowing how to process that. So, I just did what any 19-year-old would do and tried to ignore it and live in the past, which didn't serve me. It didn't allow me to actually process my experience and process his loss and process my emotions. I ended up being diagnosed with depression and high anxiety at that point. So I was like a complete mess. I didn't know how to navigate my world. I couldn't be in the present moment. I was living in the past for a solid year, and I was afraid of the future.
When you say you were living in the past, what would that look like?
I was trying to do everything he would do when he was alive. I was trying to live out and relive the days how he would, as if he was there. Okay. Make breakfast the way that he would make it for me, make my coffee the way that he would make it for me, like in just trying to really, I was trying to submerge myself in an environment, like as if he was still with me. He hadn't died.
And you mentioned it was sudden, unexpected. What did he die of?
He had a heart attack when he was out surfing. Okay. So he'd had a heart condition, had his first open heart when he was 29. And I think he had his second open heart when I was born. Mm. So he was living on borrowed time. The surgeons didn't know why his arteries kept clogging. They had no explanation for what was actually happening. But his body just kept building new new pathways, new ways to deliver all of the stuff to his body, deliver the blood, deliver everything that his body needed. His body was creating new ways to do it, and which was baffling the surgeons as well. But I think we kind of lived in denial as well. Never wanted to think that he would ever leave us. It was just like he was going to grow old and we were going to be old, and he was going to, die of old age. But yeah, that wasn't the case. I was 19, my brother was 17, and my sisters were 15. So, we were a young family, and he was only 49. Yeah, and it was, I guess, sudden, but in a way we had also a knowledge that he did have, heart issues, but never entertained the idea that we would lose him so early on. So, I lived for a good solid year as if he was still around.
Yeah.
Trying to keep his memory closer, but it was actually keeping me in my pain. And I wasn't able to process my emotions. I wasn't able to process my grief, and which led to me having to deal with all of that later on in my life. It was probably I'd say around mid-20s that I started to have, I was faced with having to process the grief and the sadness. And so it was probably a good 6 years later that I actually was having panic attacks every single day. I was waking up out of my sleep in panic attacks, and I was like, what did I dream about? Why was that so? Why am I waking up in a panic attack? But, it was just my body's way of forcing me into really just being able to process what had happened. And then in 2017, we experienced a miscarriage, which, thrust me back into that deep grief again. But the one thing that I was able to take from my dad dying was the ability to allow myself to grieve, because I knew what it was like to not do that. And I knew how much more pain I had caused myself in that moment. So even though I felt like I had absolutely no idea what a miscarriage was, I felt like I was the only person that had experienced it. And
so tell those who listen who might not know, what's a miscarriage?
So essentially I had no indication that I had actually lost the baby until I was actually miscarrying. I was not, there was no, usually there's sort of early signs of spotting or something like that, the pregnancy hasn't quite gone right. I had every, no indication that it had gone wrong. I had every, thought in my mind that everything was going perfectly, that, this was our first pregnancy. Miscarriage was not even on my radar. I didn't even know anyone around me who had experienced it. So it's not even a thought that crossed my mind until we had the ultrasound appointment, and there was the ultrasound technician was searching, and he said, "I'm sorry, there's no heartbeat." And, in that moment, there was I had conflicting emotions. I'm like, what the hell is happening? Why? What even is a miscarriage? But also on the other side of that was my worst nightmare. I was just the room closed in, everything went silent. And I was just well, now what? What does this mean for me now?
How many weeks pregnant were you at the time?
I thought I was about 10 weeks, but the baby had stopped growing at 7. So the GP told me, my doctor told me that when it takes about sort of around 3 weeks for the body to realize that the pregnancy is non-viable. And she's like, just go home and it will be, your body will just do what it needs to do. So I went home and I waited. I didn't know what to expect. Like what she told me, what I should expect was nothing like what actually happened to me. It was a very, very traumatic experience. I ended up ringing my mum and legitimately thinking I was going to die. I was like, no one can lose this much blood and survive. And, I was passing out just by standing up. And so they rushed me up to hospital. I was having contractions and I obviously had no pain relief at home that would actually help that. So, and I didn't actually even know what that was. I'd never experienced contractions before, so I didn't know that that's what I was experiencing until I got to the hospital, until they told me then what was going on. And they also told me that 1 in 4 pregnancies end in loss. And I was like, well, then why do I feel like I'm the only one? Why is there not enough information? Why does no one talk about this? I felt like I was living under a rock. It's like, where have I been my whole life to not know about this? But yeah, so ended up in hospital, ended up having an emergency procedure to obviously stop my body from miscarrying because it wasn't going to do it on its own. And they sent me home.
Wait a second, you said to stop your body from miscarrying?
Well, to complete the process, because it wasn't actually going to do it on its own. Like it wasn't stopping, like the contractions just kept coming and coming and coming. So they were just like, we have to do an emergency procedure. Yeah, the D&C to just complete it so that obviously my body stopped going through the motions. But yeah, I woke up in recovery by myself and then they sent me home and I was like, now what? Now what do I have? And I've been left with the grief and the aftermath of it and no idea of how to actually process what's been happening.
So when you were speaking about that, I just remembered my miscarriage at 10 weeks. And I don't often share about that, not because it's a secret, but because it's one of my experiences that, beside the other losses that I've experienced, is just one of them, but not the biggest in my case for me, not to say that it's not. And in my case, it's interesting because my doctor at the time, so we had an ultrasound and she said, it's not growing and you should take this tablet or you should do a D&C. And I honestly also had no idea of miscarrying, although I had pregnancy before and that was the twins. But something in me said, no, I do not want to take anything and I'm just going to wait. But I don't know where I had that from because it's not something that anyone had told me so I went home and waited. And in my case, I also had a very strong miscarriage bleeding. And I remember the extreme excruciating pain and the amount of blood, but not in the way that you're describing it. And now because I also didn't have contraction per se because I had a C-section with my twins. But yes, maybe the contraction of what I felt, or at that time I would say it's like period pain, really strong period pain, and the emotional pain of doing that. I think to some degree it also helped me complete that letting go. I didn't know what I was doing because I was, as you were saying, no one really talked me through it before it was happening.
But for you, in retrospect, do you feel that, what would you have felt that you would have needed to be better prepared?
I think just a little bit more information from the doctors, that if it was maybe worst case scenario, definitely seek out medical support sooner, because I just kept waiting. I waited and waited and waited. 3 days I waited with the blood loss. And when the ambulance arrived, they're like, "Oh, why didn't you call sooner?" And I was like, "I didn't know." The GP, my doctor told me it would be like a heavy period. And I was like, this is definitely not a heavy period. This is so much more than that. And to the point where I like I said before, I was passing out, like I couldn't even stand up. So I think maybe, I mean, I get that maybe they don't want to scare you, but in saying that, had I known there could have been contractions, had I known the bleeding could have been heavier than what they've said, I would have sought out support sooner, and it probably wouldn't have led me to have such a traumatic experience, because I wouldn't have called my mum telling her that I was going to die, and she wouldn't have, obviously, like, I was so convinced that I was going to, because I'm like, I can't do this. And I ended up writing all of my thoughts out on a piece of paper afterwards and taking it to a therapist, and she's just reading it and sort of shocked at what was in my mind and what I was feeling at the time.
So then you mentioned that you were in the hospital, you had this DNC, and then 24 hours later they sent you home. And from the sound of how you shared that, again, there wasn't enough support to know what this entails.
Yeah, nothing. I got nothing from the hospital, and no follow-up from my doctor either. All she said to me was, at the very beginning, before I'd even gone through my experience, obviously, to watch out for my mental health. And I was like, how do you do that? How do you, like, when you're spiraling out of control, how do you go, "Oh, yeah, okay, I need to go and see someone now"? You get caught in this darkness, and you're just like, well, how do you get yourself out of it? And you can't think straight. There's no way that, I mean, only because I had experienced depression and grief and everything before, I could recognize it again in myself when I was headed back down that path. But, leaving the hospital, there was no follow-up from the hospital. There was no follow-up from my doctor. And I was left to navigate this time alone. I was left to figure out what type of support I needed and when I needed it. I mean, you don't necessarily know what you need, or at the time, you're just sort of existing.
How did you find out what you needed?
It's almost like I just allowed my body to go through the motions. I knew essentially what I was feeling was grief, but it wasn't until I was starting to heal that I could start to see what it was that I needed. It was a little while after my actual loss that I started to see that clarity, but I'd say for a good period of time, a good few weeks, I was numb and I didn't want to do anything. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't think for myself. My physical body, I felt like my physical body was failing me, but it was just allowing myself to be in that space for that period of time. And then as I was starting to process those emotions and feel what I had to feel, it was almost like the fog was lifting a little bit. And then I was like, okay, now I think I need to work on my mental health. So I called a therapist at that point. I was always really good at journaling. I'm always really good at being able to just get out of my head and onto paper what's going on. So that's when I took her the pieces of paper, and I'm just like, this is everything that's been inside of me for the last few weeks. And then as my mental and emotional health started to come good, I started to realize that my physical health needed a lot of attention as well. So that's when I started to then work on my physical health. I went back to my doctor and I started to work on things with her. But it was all just like, I didn't put any pressure on myself to sort of feel a certain way or be a certain way. I just allowed myself to feel numb for however long that was, and allowed myself to feel sad. And it was almost just an unfolding. And then that clarity sort of came to me that I could start to seek professional support on the outside of myself.
But I can already hear from the way you described that you had certain resources in place, maybe from before or maybe through your resilience in itself. I mean, one of the things you mentioned was I needed to feel what I was feeling. So, I mean, that was before you said you then called a therapist. So something in you knew, okay, this is what I need to do rather than to cover it over or disassociate all the time or whatever it was that the behaviors that we normally use or that some people use. But then you also knew, okay, now it's time to look after my mental health. And you had tools to reach out, to find someone.
So the therapist that I reached out to was the therapist I ended up seeing after Dad died. So I did have an awareness of being able to do that, giving myself permission to seek that support because I knew that I needed it. And, you know, there is no shame around having to, you know, put your hand up and say, I can't do this on my own. Yeah, I definitely had, not that I had seen her recently, like in the lead up to that, but I definitely did have her in place because I had seen her, you know, for a few years after my dad, or in my late 20s when I needed to process my dad dying. So I had learnt some tools for myself just in being able to give my emotions a place. And for me to give them that place was being able to write them down on a piece of paper, just so that they were out of my body. They were on paper and I could, if I wanted to, I could read them again. But a lot of what I wrote, I just wrote it out and I didn't reread it. I gave it away. I was like, you deal with this, and gave it to my therapist. And, but I think just from Dad passing, that was where I gave myself permission to be present with myself, because I didn't do that. I didn't give myself permission when he passed away. I was like, no, this is not happening. I'm going to ignore everything that's coming up for me and try and pretend as if everything's okay. But I couldn't do that after our miscarriage. It was a completely different grief. It's such a personal grief. You blame yourself for what happened. You know, I never blamed myself for Dad passing away, but I blamed myself for everything that I did in losing my baby. So the grief is grief, but it's just, it takes on a different persona in a way, because you feel so personally responsible for it.
Yeah, the circumstances add certain components to it. One of the things that when you shared came up for me, and there was a recent conversation that I had with another colleague about the ability to deal with grief, the personal ability to hold these emotions. And somehow I feel that people do the best that they can at the time, meaning if I look at my different clients and if I look at my family members who share some of my losses, obviously my dad found my mother after she died, and I see the way that they dealt with their grief. And, like as an example, my father, looking back, he says to me, you always told me I should go and seek out some help and a therapist. And you were right. So he would say that now, but he didn't. And still, I think now after 11 years, so in January it's going to be 11 years, he's doing pretty well given the fact that he has not sought out any professional help. So it's not to say that you should or you have to. However, I see with my clients the benefit of doing that. Now, it's a personal choice. What I also see that is really helpful is peer support. And as part of the Grieving Parent Support Network, we created this peer support group called Maybe I'll Heal. And just yesterday, for example, I had 2 people sharing photos on Instagram, and they were going to a pumpkin patch together. And their children who came after their losses, they're like 8 now. And they've been sharing this friendship over what is in the States, like a couple of hours drive to each other. They've shared and continued this friendship that they found in this peer support group for all these years. And I even have like present day examples of people who then say, talking to people who've experienced what I've experienced really helps, because that's what we spoke about before. It's the normalizing and the feeling of, there's so many people, so I am actually not alone as much as I feel alone. Did you seek out any of that?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I am a type of person who I felt a natural ability to want to use my experience in life to help others. So it was a natural thing for me to start opening up about my experience. And I don't think it was that long after my miscarriage that I started to actually talk about what I was experiencing and being really raw and real. And I had a few friends reach out to me, and they actually opened up and said they had experienced the same thing. And I was like, oh my gosh, like in my circle of friends, there was 3 women who reached out and said, I've experienced pregnancy loss too. And even over the years, opening up about what I do and my experience, more people are coming out and saying, this has been my experience. I have experienced pregnancy loss myself. And, I think it definitely helped me be able to feel less alone, feel more validated, and that I wasn't making things up. Like, I felt like I was making all of my emotions up. I felt like just being emotional was, being over the top. And when I was talking to these women about, what their experience was, it validated my experience, but I think it validated theirs as well, even though they had experienced it years prior to me. They finally probably got that opportunity to say, this is what I've been going through as well. So I'd absolutely think finding people that can support you and and it was funny, I didn't think anyone around me had experienced it. I didn't think any of my friends had. And I've since found out that my grandma had 5. She had 7 kids and had 5 losses. So she had pretty much a loss in between each one of her children. And she only just opened up when I was going through, obviously, the grief of my loss. It was probably only a couple of days after my loss that she opened up and told me that she had gone through so many as well. My mum didn't even know that that had happened to my grandma. She's in her 80s and has held that pain inside of her as well, that she felt like she couldn't open up. She would, back then they're told just to get over it and, push on and keep going. There was even less support and less understanding back then. But I absolutely think, part of my healing and recovery was made easier by knowing that there was actually people around me that had experienced it as well, and people I could talk to that could validate my emotions and my feelings and everything that I had experienced.
What would you wish you would have known at the beginning of your journey?
That I'm not alone. That I think the feeling of going through something and it was literally heartbreaking. Like I honestly felt like my heart break. And to feel like that, but then to feel like you can't talk to anyone, it makes it so much worse. But I think if, when I was going through it, if there was a transparency in reaching out to communities or, just, I don't know, society being able to be that little bit more open about talking about our losses and then not trying to fix it with the, magic one-liners that people try to, fill the gaps in because they're awkward. And so they, tell you, oh, it happened for a reason. I'm like, you don't need to hear that. You need to hear words of support or just someone to say, I will just sit with you in silence and you don't have to say anything. But I feel like if I had have felt less alone, I would have, I don't know, I think that would have made a huge difference in the way that I was able to heal and recover.
And I think you made it your mission to change the face of people feeling less alone. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I always felt like I had a gift, and I'm a qualified dental nurse. I was doing it for 14 years, and I got a letter one day from a patient saying that I was an asset to the surgery, that I had helped her with her anxiety in being in the chair. And that was literally just me holding space for her, telling her that she will be okay. And she has every right to feel nervous and anxious because it's not a place that people really want to be, is in the dental chair and people invading your space. And it got her through her appointment, and she wrote a handwritten letter and delivered it to the surgery. And from that moment on, I knew that there was something that I could share. That was my gift I could share. I just didn't know how that was going to look. And then we had our miscarriage, and I was like, this is it. This is how I'm going to use my gift. And I started by supporting and guiding women through, navigating that really tough time, navigating the darkness, the grief, the emotions, creating that safe space and having someone to talk to that deeply understands what they're going through. But then the universe was delivering me some more signs that I had to take my experience even bigger than that. And so now I've created an education, a certification program that I can teach what I was actually teaching my clients. I can teach that to other people, and they can learn how to hold space for women who have gone through this type of loss and trauma, because it has a ripple effect through your whole entire life. Every place a woman shows up, it's affected by loss if she's not able to process it. So, yeah, I believe my mission is to change the way that support is accessed and have that transparency in, even coming from the doctors. Some of my programs have been picked up by IVF specialists. So I'm like, if, coming from them,
I'm glad you say that. I mean, we have definitely a common mission there in place. And just remembered before when you were speaking, my IVF doctor here in Switzerland, the last time I had the miscarriage that I was talking about before, she said, well, but I told you that you're already older and that I told you about your chances. I'm like, well, if that's your grief support, you need to have my book. But she would probably not have read my book. But I'm going to put all those links in the show notes for people to find you and to click through your certification program and what you have to offer. I think it's fantastic what you're doing, and I'm so glad the more people come onto this scene to help. Not just now in October as we're recording this, which is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month, this week Baby Loss Awareness Week, but just in general for people to feel less alone. And because I feel personally, I had great support at the beginning after my loss. And I think it was just serendipity that the way it lined up for me to be supported so well. Mm. So how about we finish this with the rapid fire question? Shall we do that?
Yes. I'm nervous, but let's do this.
So the first one is grieving and trauma means?
It means heartache, but it also means compassion.
And healing means?
The opportunity to live your most truest self.
What I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
My resilience.
And one thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma?
That it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to grieve.
And one specific thing that has changed since my loss and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss?
My life. It's just changed. It's shifted the way that I view my life now and my daughter's life.
What would you say, how has it changed? If you were to give us one of the glimpses into Sharna's post-loss life.
I've been able to embody my pain as well as live where I'm experiencing more appreciation and more gratitude and more joy. And I just feel like unfortunately, I've had to experience the darkness to know what it's like to be able to experience the light as well. And it's just given me a deeper appreciation for everything that I go through, even the really crappy times.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and your healing and the way you've dealt with those traumatic losses in your life. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me in your space.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.